Do it.
Do it!
Do it.
Do it.
Do it.
I guarantee you when the next big popular series comes out and that show ends up having an awful final season, people will go back to Game of Thrones Season 8 and say, you know what, it actually wasn't that bad. And I feel like this is the attitude most people have towards the Star Wars prequels. And I feel like this is the attitude most people have towards the Star Wars prequels.
And I feel like this is the attitude most people have towards the Star Wars prequels.
What orders from Mordor, my lord? What does the Eye command?
We have work to do.
I couldn't believe some of the things they wrote about the prequels, you know? I mean, but really, beyond, I didn't like it. You ruined my childhood, and I'm still angry about the way they treated Jake Lloyd. He was only 10 years old, that boy, and he did exactly what George wanted him to do. Believe me, I understand clunky dialogue. So I almost got hornswoggled in that documentary where they weren't calling it The People versus George Lucas at the time, but I could tell from the questions they were asking me, it was an open invitation to trash George.
George Lucas raped our childhood. 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 George Lucas raped our childhood.
And I have issues with George, but I love that man.
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun, and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way. I don't like that. I never did. I started out in experimental films, and I want to go back to experimental films. But of course, nobody wants to see experimental films.
The main thing is to protect these characters. Make sure that they still continue to live in the way that you created them.
I'm curious that the Force doesn't get muddled into a bunch of garbly-gook.
Can I just say, though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, we got to think about the fans. And he said, no, we got to think about the story, and we got to think about our movie. Which I, you know...
Hello there, and Merry Christmas. Bet you didn't expect to wake up and see this video sitting under the tree.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
We are back with Revenge of the Prequels, and today we are discussing Weasel Batches, or Diesel Patches. This is a strange one. I don't know. Much like the rest of the people on this long list, who have very moronic takes on the prequels, as movies, and the fandom surrounding them. Now, to be fair to Mr. Weasel here, he's not all wrong about what he has to say, and we'll get into why in a minute. In truth, he actually shares a lot of takes surrounding Star Wars that I do as well. But as the video progresses, it's going to become very apparent what he's getting wrong and why I have an issue with it, especially if you've watched the previous 15 episodes in this series. Ultimately, this is nothing personal. I've made this abundantly clear by this point. My issue with Weasel, and any others I cover on this series, starts and ends with the videos. He's just another name on the list, and he's not going to be the last. That I can guarantee you. Now, since my last video on this series came out, I've been asked probably non-stop about when the next video will be coming out. So just so that doesn't happen this time, the next Revenge of the Prequels will likely be in May 2021. And unlike this video, which is essentially a one-off for Christmas, the ones in May will be about what you'd expect from the Cosmonaut videos, so get excited, I guess. But yeah, just quickly, if this is your first time watching this series, I strongly suggest you go back to the first episode and work your way down the list. If you're new to this topic, I guarantee your eyes will be opened. to just how mind-blowingly stupid the internet has been when criticizing the prequels, there will come a point where you wonder why they were even hated by the internet in the first place, or why anyone was ever stupid enough to listen to those people. And if you think I'm joking, I'll happily let you call my bluff. Now, you can either watch them in order, but I would recommend actually watching this one first, being completely honest. Yes, it's very long, but it's easily my best work and will paint a very clear picture about why the prequel hate is so unfounded, where it came from, why it exists, and why, like, 99% of it is just factually incorrect. And then the other videos should follow suit very nicely. So that's it for the new people, but just before we begin, a quick reminder for my subscribers. If you're interested in more content and if you haven't been made aware yet, I've actually been running 2 additional channels to this one. The first is called NOMZ, fitting, I know, and that talks about video games, both reviewing their quality and discussing their controversies. The second channel, and more applicable to this video, is the archive channel where I re-upload this channel's podcast episodes, many of which deconstruct videos much like this one on this very topic, as you can see here. Check out both channels at your leisure, and I hope you find something to your liking. Right, that's enough introduction, let's move on to this video.
I know most people voted for top 20 worst movies of all time during my polling, but that video is going to take a lot longer than I thought. Besides, I think this video was the runner-up for the polling. Plus, it's my channel, I can do whatever the fuck I want. But today I'll be talking about appreciating what we used to hate. This is a topic I feel like we've all encountered at some point, but it's never really been talked about. At least, I haven't found a video about it.
Okay, so here's where I want to be fair to Weasel and meet him halfway. Appreciating what we used to hate is certainly something that human beings tend to do when something new comes out and they tend to hate it more. A personal example that I will use is Terminator 3. I was an 8-year-old at the time of its release, and Terminator 2 being my favorite movie of all time back then, I was pumped out of my mind to see T3. And then I did, and well, honestly, I really hated it. Now, as I became more mature, it eventually grew on me more and more, but the biggest downer for me about that film was the ending, because it felt like it undercut the beautiful ending of Terminator 2, and not to mention the plot was very derivative of that movie. When Terminator Salvation came out, which I actually really like, by the way, Terminator 3 improved even more in my eyes, because I was like, wow, okay, at least that bleak ending actually led somewhere, and it didn't just end depressingly. Then Terminator Genisys and Terminator Dark Fate, especially Dark Fate, came out and were abominations, and then I really warmed up to Terminator 3. And when I watched it again, I realized that unlike all of Terminator Dark Fate and most of Terminator Genisys, there was some actual great character work in there. I'd go as far as to say excellent character work in Terminator 3. There is more character in John Connor's opening monologue in Terminator 3 than Terminator Genisys and Dark Fate combined. Also, Terminator 3 was much more mature than Terminator Genisys in many intelligent ways, while Terminator Dark Fate had probably the most mature rating in terms of violence and gore, but instead of being intelligent with it, it just ejaculated nonsense all over the screen. Terminator Dark Fate and Terminator Genisys being terrible movies did make me go back and appreciate Terminator 3, yes. Was it a good movie that I just thought was bad? Or was it a bad movie that I just hated for the wrong reasons? I can't definitively tell you whether or not Terminator 3 is a good or bad movie. I'd have to spend more time with it, but what I can say definitively is that I did hate that movie for the wrong reasons, because I simply didn't get what I wanted from that film when it first released, which at the time was twice everything that Terminator 2 Judgment Day gave me, and a happy definitive ending to the story. I didn't get that with T3, and I was really disappointed and hateful when I first watched it as an 8-year-old. But just because I didn't get those things doesn't inherently make the film bad. And the stuff I'm appreciating about the film now didn't just magically appear in the movie. Terminator 3 has been exactly the same since 2003. All of its positive traits have always been there, I just never registered them before. And now that I have, it makes me wonder why I ever hated the film in the first place. Appreciating what we used to hate isn't by default liking bad movies in the shadow of a worse one. These things need to be judged case by case. And that's besides the fact that this statement can be used in reverse, criticizing what we used to love. Spider-Man 2 was one of my favorite movies of all time, and one of the most influential movies for me growing up. I used to think it was awesome and unparalleled in the category of Spider-Man live-action movies. And then I recently started watching out-of-context clips on YouTube, and I started thinking, man, I still love this movie, but I've already started spotting massive problems with it. Some reflection and criticizing what I used to love, Spider-Man 2 isn't the god tier of Spider-Man movies for me anymore. It's a heavily flawed film with a great story that I still love. Just like the prequels, for some people, as much as they don't want to accept it, can be great movies that they can still hate. Because here's a newsflash, they are. And that's what people are realizing by going back and watching them. Actually watching them.
I mean, there are multiple videos talking about how we've underestimated the prequels, but that's just one of the arguments included in this video. And yeah, if you haven't guessed yet, the Star Wars prequels are going to serve as the main example. So a little background behind these films.
You know, I sometimes have to force myself to not talk about the prequels when discussing them, because you'd be amazed how many examples they can be used for in a discussion about things like fandoms, directing style, media authenticity, universal and character consistency, ethics surrounding the creative process. The list goes on and on.
After the original trilogy, everyone was excited to see the prequels. Same director, same composer, and even some of the same actors. A lot of people were hyped. Then The Phantom Menace was actually released, and I would have to say that majority of the people who saw the movie reacted negatively, but at the same time, majority of Star Wars fans were hyped for the next movie.
Well, that's a misconception. Sure, when people like Chris Stockman and Red Letter Media talk about why everyone hates the Star Wars prequels and how the prequels were always hated, and my personal favorite, the majority of us think that they were disappointing.
Endure people hating on them and trashing them for many, many years. And while there are fans of the prequels out there, I think the majority of us can agree they were very disappointing movies.
Everyone wants to think or try to persuade people that their stance on the matter is what the majority of people think, because it helps sell what they have to say, especially if they have an audience in the hundreds of thousands of people. When in the case of the prequels at least, nothing could be further from the truth. Growing up, I personally didn't meet a single person who wasn't into the prequels, except for people who weren't really into Star Wars in the first place. And since I started this video series, I've had countless of people who were adults at the time of their release who tell me just how adored those films were. The exception of those people was a minority that festered on the internet at the time that ended up being some of the first personalities to discuss film criticism on the YouTube platform. Individuals that were thought to have some credibility that people took way more seriously than they should have, which ultimately resulted in one of the first truly widespread online bandwagons driven mostly by blind hatred based off someone else's faulty perspective or just sheer ignorance. Now that's the taste that was left in everyone's mouth in the years since the prequels released. But free of the internet, and especially when the films launched, the prequels were beloved movies by the majority of fans. What you're seeing on the internet after the launch of the abominable Star Wars sequel trilogy is people's eyes opening, because a truly bad Star Wars movie hadn't been released yet, and now that, short of damping their credibility, the internet personalities couldn't spin the prequel narrative anymore, although some, bless their hearts, still tried to, people woke up to the bullshit, and now they are actively praising the prequels because, one, they realize just how many other people exist that share their perspective, so dump a turd on that majority of people hate them narrative, and two, because they know just how full of shit those internet personalities were.
But then Attack of the Clones came out, and everyone hated it.
Again, no. No, they did not. Many people, in fact, the majority, at release, loved Attack of the Clones. Although, to be fair, I do understand why some people are jaded towards Attack of the Clones even to this day. Even though those people are incorrect about the film's quality, I can understand how a lot of that film's substance can go over someone's head, especially at face value. Attack of the Clones is all about paying very close attention, not to mention with the added context of its prequel, The Phantom Menace, which people like Doug Walker and other supposed experts think you should skip when you watch the Star Wars saga. Yeah, I'm not even joking. These are the same people who think they know what they're talking about regarding the prequels. And sadly, who some choose to believe. Anyway, once you realize that in context, what these characters say, why they say, and how they say it, as well as their decisions, make complete sense with who they are and what they know based on the timeline. You realize that Attack of the Clones has plenty to offer and is easily, in my opinion anyway, the most underrated Star Wars movie in the whole saga. I've gone over this multiple times in my series, so I'll be brief here. Regarding the quality of Attack of the Clones, people often use the sand quote from Anakin as an easy jab at the film's quality, saying that George Lucas doesn't understand romance and the dialogue is terrible, and they do this in order to appeal to that narrative, even in passing with videos that aren't even related to the subject, in an attempt to nab more likes from that demographic, which adds to their algorithm, which adds to views, etc., etc. But ask yourself this, and this is the question that changed my perception on all of the prequels, after it was soured years after their release by the internet itself. I asked myself, how would a teenager who's grown up as a slave boy in the middle of nowhere and removed from attachment for the majority of his adolescence, know what to do or what to say in this situation. Being alone in a romantic location with someone he clearly likes but doesn't know how to express that to her. How would Padme, someone who's been trapped in public service her whole life, first as royalty and then as a senator, know how to behave in this situation with someone she's given subtle hints at being attracted to by her eye contact, her body language, and how she dresses in front of him, but someone who's also her bodyguard and is forbidden to return those feelings to her? They are both fish out of water and are unfamiliar with the scenario they are both placed in with each other. The dialogue during the scene isn't meant to be romantic as much as it's meant to represent how both their pasts reflect how they are from two completely different worlds. The romance is a byproduct of that, and the majority of it is represented visually. People criticize this scene for being awkward. Would it surprise you to learn that they were criticizing it for being exactly what it was intended to be, since George Lucas referred to the scene as awkward in the Blu-ray commentary? Yes, that's a fact, actually, and you'll find that in my other videos. Anyway, let's move on.
Eventually, the hype kind of died down a bit, but people were still looking forward to episode 3. And after that movie was released, it was pretty half and half. It's often regarded as the better of the 3, which isn't much of a compliment, but more Star Wars fans liked episode 3 more than 2 and 1.
No, it's a massive compliment. As good as episodes 1 and 2 were, episode 3 blows them out of the water and actually elevates just about every other film in the saga. It's that good. Yes, even the original trilogy is heavily elevated by Revenge of the Sith. Perhaps I'll make a video one day, because it's something I would love to talk about.
All 3 movies were financial successes, but were overall considered negative additions to the franchise. Not to kid ourselves, these movies were labeled as absolute failures overall.
Yeah, it really does sound stupid looking back now, doesn't it?
Star Wars fans overall believed that the prequels couldn't even be considered in the same caliber as the original trilogy.
Well, those Star Wars fans obviously never saw Return of the Jedi, which I could happily lump into the criticizing what we used to love category, which, as I previously mentioned, is the reverse of what this video is trying to outline, which is how fans perceive and change their minds over time. And Return of the Jedi's lacking quality aside, the original trilogy still has a ton of problems in their own right. Make no mistake about it.
But when 2014 came along, we got a new trailer for Star Wars 7. Most people, including myself, were excited for this movie. But after the initial release of The Force Awakens, the movie received the same feedback as Revenge of the Sith. Mixed feelings. Some people thought it was a great Star Wars movie, some people thought it was a repetition of Episode 4. But what's important to think about is that because a lot of Star Wars fans reacted positively towards this movie, it wasn't really considered a horrible film overall.
That's very true. But it's also important to note that while the majority of people were high on The Force Awakens, for its time anyway, those same people were souring very quickly because a lot of the praise for what was set up was based on how it would eventually pay off.
It's like, okay, cool, and he's a really cool pilot.
Ray is definitely my favorite character. She's awesome. Especially when...
You know what? I'm going to say this right now. Because this is one thing that him and I were geeking out about the whole time we kept saying it. We're just like, she's totally Luke's daughter. She has to be. She has to be Skywalker. Because I mean, freaking she uses the Force and everything. And then she's holding the lightsaber. And I'm just geeking out about keys.
Well, and it was like, and it's one thing is like, especially when they keep teasing it, and then at the end, she like Luke, like Anakin's lightsaber is in the snow because Starkiller Base has this atmosphere and it's like a snowy forest planet. And Finn loses the fight with Kylo Ren, obviously, and the lightsaber falls, and then Kylo Ren is trying to grab it, then it flies past him, and then Rey gets it, and she's like, "Bang!"
What's the theme you hear?
Luke's theme!
And I'm just like, she's gotta be a Skywalker!
As a matter of fact, this film received a ton of criticism, and the only way some people could circumvent it was, yeah, well, just wait till The Last Jedi. It's going to answer all of your criticism, and it's going to answer all of our questions and conspiracy theories. People soured on this film way quicker than some people, on the internet at least, soured on the prequels.
Revenge of the Sith had mixed feelings, The Force Awakens had mixed feelings, but while the franchise wasn't making any significant progress, at least it wasn't taking a step back. And then The Last Jedi came out, and that's exactly where we landed.
What? You thought I was going to add to that? No, I'm good. Nothing wrong with that statement whatsoever.
Yes, there are a few people who like this movie, but majority of Star Wars fans despise it. Star Wars fans hated The Last Jedi way more than the prequels when those movies came out. The franchise overall took a huge step back. Now, when episode 7 was released, I've noticed that people started to warm up to the prequels just a little bit. I would even go back to old prequel videos, just clips of the Star Wars prequels, and I noticed people in the comic section saying, this is way better than The Force Awakens, these movies are underappreciated.
Yeah, and they weren't wrong either, because as I previously laid the groundwork for, those people began to open their eyes.
It was only like 1 or 2 comments, but after The Last Jedi came out, pretty much every single comment on a prequel video was just that. People saying the prequels are underappreciated and the sequels suck. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that statement, but it is funny to me how when shittier movies come out, we go back to the older movies and then make excuses for them and act like they're better than they once were.
That's true, and I dislike it as much as you do when it's warranted, but this needs to be judged case by case. I think a better comparison, even though it doesn't exactly correlate to your point, is people praising The Mandalorian, which came out after the sequels, because hooray, we have a show that isn't sequel trilogy bad, despite the fact that that show is easily the most overrated thing I've ever seen in my life, and I'll confidently say, since I've examined The Mandalorian quite a bit, that these people are just blatantly looking at this shit show with the thickest of rose-tinted goggles, because they are desperately trying to love Star Wars again. And they've set their standards so low that The Mandalorian having a protagonist who's literally so stupid that he forgets his jetpack is now the gold standard of a Star Wars character for them. And not to mention, if you want to criticize an episode for how poorly it implements a character like Boba Fett, or Bo-Katan, or Luke Skywalker, or Ahsoka Tano, or the Krayt Dragon, enjoy your instant downvote and insufferable whining without an actual argument in the comment section, because hey, Baby Yoda is cute, and that's all that matters, right? And Boba Fett did the pew-pew. And oh, look, Bo-Katan mentioned the Darksaber. Oh, look, Ahsoka mentioned Thrawn. The Mandalorian is the show that's so soulless and hollow that it solely exists to set up other shows with more profitable fan-favorite characters, because no one gives a shit about Din Djarin, the protagonist of The Mandalorian. No one gives a shit about him unless he's holding that fucking puppet. Hence why Season 3, now that they've brought him into the mix and resurrected him and fans are clapping like a fucking seal, Season 3 of The Mandalorian is going to be all about Boba Fett, because fuck it, that was always the plan all along, just to find a way to somehow ejaculate Boba Fett all over the screens. The Mandalorian is a much better example of people taking their hatred of a product that they know is insultingly bad and falsely praising a product in the same IP that isn't quite as bad, although The Mandalorian is becoming pretty damn close. The prequels, objectively mind you, the prequels deserve every bit of praise they get because they've been the same since 1999. They haven't changed, but people's perception has, after examining them on the same merits they've had for over 20 years and realizing how much quality they possessed. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The prequels don't get worse the more you think about them, they actually get better. They don't discourage the audience from thinking like The Mandalorian or the sequels or The Dark Knight Rises or Transformers does. George Lucas actually wants the audience to think when watching them. And if you disagree with me, call my bluff.
The fanbase started to warm up to the prequels because the sequels were just that bad.
No they didn't. Granted, some people did, and personally I hate when people say, in my own comment sections mind you, that the prequels were way better than the sequels, because when worded that way it does kind of feel like it's being said out of spite. Personally, I don't think you should make comparisons within the Star Wars saga as trilogy versus trilogy. You should compare them as movies, and without a doubt the prequels hold up to the originals as both a trilogy and as movies. Yep, I said it! But back on point, some people are loving the prequels despite the sequels. And I hate it just as much as you do, because that's the wrong way to go about it. The problem I have with Weasel here is that he's framing this as the majority of praise those movies are receiving, which simply isn't true. What about the shit ton of people that never soured on and have loved them ever since release? What about people like me who grew up watching them and loving them, then had the internet sour those movies for me in the first place, only to go back and examine them on my own terms after The Last Jedi and realize how moronic the criticism against those movies was? What about the people who are now only just being introduced to the prequels, etc., etc.? It's incredibly lazy and disingenuous to cast a label misrepresenting the majority of praise the prequels are getting simply because it rubbed you the wrong way.
Now, many people debate whether or not the sequels helped us open our eyes to the prequels.
Well, you're only half right. Again, that's not the majority of people doing that. The majority of people are simply waking up and disregarding the internet bullshit. Again, it's not like the prequels changed. They've stayed the same for over a decade at this point. People are simply registering what they always had to offer but never cared to digest until now because politics boring, CGI bad, the internet is genius, yada yada gets Stuckmanized.
But personally, I feel like a lot of people are only saying good things about the prequels because they just want to spite the sequels. Many people did this for Game of Thrones Season 8. After the final season was received mostly negative, people went back to older TV shows with universally disliked last seasons and praised them. Most people hated the final seasons of Lost, The Sopranos, Dexter, but now suddenly they like these endings because the final season of Game of Thrones is perceived as terrible in comparison. I guarantee you when the next big popular series comes out and that show ends up having an awful final season, people will go back to Game of Thrones Season 8 and say, you know what, it actually wasn't that bad.
Whoa, let me stop you right there, champ. That is never going to happen. And that's possibly the worst example you could give. Game of Thrones Season 8 is arguably worse than the Star Wars sequel trilogy. What you're doing here is ignoring the fact that people can overlook the quality of media, and that sometimes a product isn't appreciated in its own time and can age well due to more exposure and increasing amounts of well-deserved praise and appreciation. I can't really comment on people praising the finale of other shows after the Game of Thrones Season 8 released, because I haven't seen them. But simply saying just give it a few years, people will be coming out with videos saying how Game of Thrones Season 8 is secretly brilliant, some people might, since I do agree that people tend to go back and appreciate what they used to hate. That's certainly a pattern of behavior I've seen on the internet, but whether or not they are right to do so is case by case. And sure, some might do it to spite the latest disappointment, but the majority certainly will not because the majority has a brain. And just honestly, I hate when people very disingenuously use the most extreme examples to mask the legitimacy of something they disagree with or something they aren't entirely fond of. For example, oh, so you like The Sopranos ending now? You didn't before. So predictable you are. Next thing you know, in a few years, you're going to be praising Game of Thrones Season 8, which is just like some people saying that the prequels are only praised because of the sequels. I've been told countless times regarding this very video series that 20 years from now, someone's going to grow up and make a Revenge of the Sequels series. And they say this as a means of discrediting my work, as if, oh yeah, there's always one of them, don't listen to this guy, he's just a contrarian. He's crawled out from under a rock and now he's spouting his mouth, and soon there's going to be someone defending the sequel trilogy too, just like what he's doing with the prequels. But I have news for Weasel here and everyone else who's uttered that moronic statement to me. There's actually nuance behind what I do. I know some people are allergic to nuance, but here it is. Firstly, I highly doubt someone can credibly do a Revenge of the Sequels series because there's very little to praise there. Not to mention those movies have been disavowed by Disney themselves and the actors. Secondly, sure, that someone may try to do it, but the majority won't agree with what they are going to say because the sequels have been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be terrible movies. And finally, you can't make a series like mine about the Disney films because the prequels were made by the original creator. The sequels were bought and paid for by a corporate entity. My series doesn't just discuss the films, it discusses the ethics behind the films and the authenticity of them, something that the sequels are completely devoid of. In other words, it's apples and oranges, though in the case of the sequels, it's a rotten apple. What I'm trying to say, back on point, is you aren't making an active attempt to understand the majority. You're just casting labels and misrepresenting the nuances behind why people go back and appreciate what they used to hate, which can vary in legitimacy on a case-by-case basis. In the case of the prequels, it just so happens to be legitimate. But for some reason, you're using the very extreme example of Game of Thrones Season 8 as a means of discrediting that legitimacy. It's very surface level and very slimy of you. And that's what's bogging this video down in terms of its quality, because I appreciate that you've brought up this topic, Weasel, but I'm disappointed by how you've gone about it.
And I feel like this is the attitude most people have towards the Star Wars prequels. I swear, right after The Last Jedi came out, people went back to the prequels and sucked its dick.
Well, the prequels have a fucking fantastic dick. I should know, I ride that hard, veiny alpha on a regular fucking basis. That shit's irresistible and oh so delicious.
Those three movies get so much praise now, and I don't think it's really well deserved. I don't think people overreacted when The Phantom Menace came out because comparing that movie to the original trilogy, it's not even close.
You're gonna tell me that the hatred surrounding The Phantom Menace wasn't overreacted? You mean the hatred that ruined Jake Lloyd's life growing up? The hatred that bitched and moaned about politics in The Phantom Menace, despite the film itself having less than 2 minutes of Senate meetings for its entire duration, the overreaction to Darth Maul dying that was so ridiculously overblown at Lucasfilm in the years since brought him back to life in the most fucking contrived way possible. You're going to tell me that the backlash to The Phantom Menace by a vocal minority of Star Wars fans wasn't overreacted? That's bullshit. And saying that The Phantom Menace isn't even on the same level as the original trilogy, again, I guess you've never seen Return of the Jedi. In terms of quality, The Phantom Menace takes a giant steaming dump on Return of the Jedi, as does Attack of the Clones. To be clear, I like Return of the Jedi, but the first 2 acts of that movie are a complete mess and more broken than anything in episodes 1 and 2 by a country mile. And honestly, if we're ranking the Star Wars movies here, personally, I find it very hard to rank episodes 4, 1, and 2 in terms of their quality, because I think they're all about even. All of them. But each film excels in a different way from one another. And even though I don't like comparing trilogies within the Star Wars saga, I gotta say the prequels are the better trilogy. Primarily, but not limited to, the timeline of the films and how clear it is, which is actually much messier in the original trilogy, particularly between episodes 5 and 6. Now, that's not the only reason why I think the prequels are the better trilogy. Anyway, yeah, it's clear to me that you haven't really taken the time to explore the nuances of this topic, and if you actually took note of why people are praising the prequels, you wouldn't be saying that The Phantom Menace doesn't compare to the oh-so-precious original trilogy.
Phantom Menace has its moments, but it's overall a pretty bad movie. Personally, I think Attack of the Clones is an enhancement upon a Phantom Menace, but not by much. It's okay at best. And Revenge of the Sith is the only movie I would consider to be in the original trilogy caliber. Yeah, it's goofy and cheesy at some points, but it's overall a pretty solid film. So yeah, the prequels definitely have their flaws, but now they're being overlooked.
No, you have it backwards, dickhead. The prequels had a quantum fuck ton of quality that people were overlooking because they were too busy throwing hissy fits about Senate meetings that they couldn't be bothered paying attention to, while at the same time criticizing the movie for being bad without understanding it. Again, people like Nostalgia Critic think you can just skip The Phantom Menace entirely, and Cosmonaut Variety Hour openly admitted on his Why the Prequels Suck video that it took him 20 years to understand The Phantom Menace. That is not the fault of the prequels, and it's certainly not the fault of George Lucas.
I even see some people saying Jar Jar is funny now just because Rose Tico was so bad. Are you fucking kidding me? Jar Jar? The guy who butt-raped the whole galaxy because he gave power to Palpatine? Yeah, we love that character now. He's awesome. And funny too. I love his fart jokes.
Speaking of the prequel's worst criticisms, Jar Jar Binks is probably at the top of the list. Imagine finding a child demographic comic relief character to be a movie breaker.
The stories were meant for kids. I mean, have you met a kid who really hates Jar Jar Binks?
Actually, my little cousin hates him a lot.
How much of your influence did you give to him while the entire time you were watching the movie? Doesn't he suck? Doesn't he suck? Your little cousin was like, yeah, no, I completely agree.
Despite the fact that the film and its characters are self-aware that Jar Jar Binks is annoying. You'd think if people had their head firmly removed from their asses, they might have recognized that Jar Jar Binks is possibly one of the most relatable characters in Star Wars. Because he is the outcast. He is the character who is hated by everyone. He is the character that is misunderstood. Someone who wants to try and do good but ultimately ends up making things worse, despite his best intentions. But no, there's a couple of blink and you miss it moments where the character steps in shit, and that's what people have a problem with. And pretend it's the end of the world. Because that's what sells on the internet, or at least it used to. I've already gone through why Jar Jar's humor in a lot of instances is practically utilized in The Phantom Menace. I've done that in other videos. But above all else, the character has an important purpose. He's the clumsy outcast who finds himself in a position of power, who is ultimately manipulated by a mastermind to do something incredibly drastic, which ultimately starts a domino effect that brings about the fall of the galaxy. That actually mirrors real life quite well, in fact, because how many wars in human history have been started because an idiot was in a position of power they didn't deserve? And honestly, I love Jar Jar. I loved him when I was a kid, and I loved him as an adult. Hell, I even have a shirt at home that says this on it, and I wear it unapologetically. Jar Jar Binks is easily the stupidest and most overblown criticism of the prequels, and if you're actually using that to this day to illustrate your point that the prequels are bad, that's a mark of shame and you should be embarrassed.
Like, do you guys get what I'm saying? After the releasement of The Phantom Menace, no one above the age of 10 liked this character. But now everyone wants to suck his alien dick because that pudgy Asian failed to do her job.
Some people maybe, or some people who I should call sane people, could have just never had an issue with Jar Jar in the first place. And like it or not, Rose Tico is one of the best defenses against people saying that Jar Jar Binks was pointless in the prequels. Rose Tico was pointless. That's the definition of a terrible, pointless character. Jar Jar actually had purpose. Put it this way, Jar Jar Binks had more depth, purpose, and practicality as a character in the prequels than Boba Fett did in episodes 5 and 6 of the original trilogy. No, The Mandalorian doesn't count because 1, that's done by Disney, and George never intended to give Boba a real character arc. He's just an overblown fan wet dream. And 2, The Mandalorian doesn't count because fuck The Mandalorian.
So, yeah, in my opinion, I don't think the initial reaction towards liking the prequels was genuine. And if you do enjoy the prequels now, good for you. I personally believe that it's kind of toxic to suddenly like something just because it's better in comparison to something else. Just because something is better doesn't necessarily make it good.
Yeah, and just because something is popularly hated on the internet because it's profitable doesn't make it bad. Just because people regurgitate the same tired, nonsensical arguments against the prequels doesn't make them true. And just because people are going back and appreciating something they used to hate doesn't make them wrong when they actually realize, yeah, the internet's full of fucking idiots. I'm going to form my own opinions from now on. And I'll tell you what's toxic. Misrepresenting majorities on the internet is toxic. And misrepresenting something you disagree with is toxic. And failing to understand the nuances behind people's perspectives and casting labels and false equivalences on them to discredit their newly found perspective and the legitimacy behind it is very toxic. You're the poster child for misrepresenting the opposition when you disagree with them. And your take on the prequel's praise in recent years not only tells me very clearly that you're out of touch, but it also tells me that you don't want to understand. You just want to label people, pat yourself on the back, move on thinking job well done, because that's much easier than actually putting work into understanding people who disagree with you and growing as a person. Don't worry, you're not the first and you're certainly not the worst that I've come across that meets that criteria. But if I can say some positive things before I wrap this video up, it's that Weasel here chose an interesting topic to discuss. I've seen a few of his videos and I've liked most of them. And I respect the idea of what he was doing here. I just think it came across as very disingenuous and ultimately incorrect on most accounts. There are certainly people doing what he says they are doing, but I hate when people false paint majorities to get their point across. To sum it up, the majority of praise for the prequels are not mindless spiting of the sequels. Anyone who's actually watched those movies would know that. And appreciating what we used to hate by default doesn't mean illegitimate praise for something that's always going to be bad. Again, that's a case-by-case thing, and each case needs to be proven. Though appreciating what we used to hate is certainly a common pattern of human behavior. And again, this behavior can be done in reverse with criticizing what you used to love. And neither behavior is illegitimate or false for either praise or criticism until proven so. Anyway guys, that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you have an extra minute, consider staying for the outro. Firstly, if you are looking for more content, you should head over to my secondary channel that talks about video games, and my archive channel if you're a fan of the channel's podcast. Both are linked below, and I hope to see you there. Secondly, if you haven't already, please check out the channel's Discord server. What Discord basically is an online community where followers of the channel go to congregate and talk about a range of different topics, ranging from Star Wars to Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, and so on. Check it out at your leisure, and who knows, maybe you'll make some friends along the way. I've also linked a video about Discord in the description in case you had any questions. Thirdly, I want to give a shout out to all of my patrons and YouTube members for all of your contributions to the channel. I greatly appreciate the generosity and your support. If you'd like to become a patron or a channel member, the link to Patreon is in the description, or you can just press the join button and become a channel member that way. Finally, here's one last thank you for staying till the end of the video. You are a legend. Have a Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next time.